And when Diane was talking earlier about the problem with the generations and just the lack of commitment to principle or what have you, I was reminded of the story of the baby boomer who was just in a terrible accident, found themselves in the hospital on their deathbed. And so his wife says, "Oh, we got to get the priest in here and give your last rites and whatnot." So the priest comes in and sees the guy there. He's kind of hurt, but he's still awake. He's still somewhat alert. The priest's like, "Look, Bob, you're going to go any minute now. I need you to renounce Satan and accept the Lord. Just do that for me before you go." Just lays there quiet, not saying anything. It's like, "Bob, come on, you're about to flatline, buddy. Just renounce Satan and accept the Lord." Just lays there silent. He says, "Bob, what's wrong with you, man? You're about to go. You got to do this. You got to renounce Satan and accept the Lord." And Bob looks up at him and says, "Listen, until I'm 100% sure about where I'm going when I die, I don't want to offend anybody." And that's kind of the mentality of your average American today. It's an unwillingness to commit to principle, to commit to truth for truth's sake. Well, I gotta roll the dice. I gotta weigh my options and see really what's going to work out best for me. So that's the kind of problem that we face, and it's one which is creating a real existential crisis for us. This lack of a commitment to truth or to principle. So just to kind of maybe get at some of this, and we'll get into some of the work that myself and others have been doing of late in the basement, some of the scientific work we've been doing. But to start, let's just go out on a limb here and assume that everyone here is relatively sane. Okay? So assuming that, now for anyone here, if you were walking and you started to approach what appeared to be a very high cliff, in all likelihood you would stop and turn around. And if you asked you, "Why'd you do that?" you'd say, "Well, because I didn't want to fall off the cliff. I would die." And if you're then asked further, "Well, how do you know?" Well, you'd be able to explain some sort of experiential circumstance where, somewhere in your life you sort of deduce the fact that there's this thing which people call gravity, and maybe you say, yes, there's a law of the universe, gravity, universal gravitation. But for most people, it's an experiential kind of thing. Whatever, you drop something, you see that things fall. Everything seems to, whenever released from a higher height, it tends to fall. And you can sort of deduce from that if you walked over a very high cliff, you would have a very long fall and probably result in your death. So but from for most people, that's purely an experiential kind of deduction. You have some experiential evidence which leads you to say, "Okay, I'd turn around, I wouldn't walk off the cliff." But yet most people then claim that they have an idea, "Well, I know there's a principle involved. I know gravity as a principle." But for most people, it's actually not a principle. It's purely just an experience of the senses, and they claim to know it as a principle because they've been told in school or what have you that there is this principle of gravitation. But, a baby might not make that same choice. Right? A baby, if it was just sort of born and started to crawl off towards a cliff and there was no adult there to supervise it, that baby just, due to its lack of experience, might just walk off that cliff and fall to its doom. Now the thing is, that's kind of the situation that humanity faces right now, is that because one, most people do not take the time to investigate and understand principle, and don't actually know in terms of principle where we are historically, where we are universally. They tend to act purely off of simple impulse or simple experience. But there's nothing in your experience which tells you the kind of crisis that you're now facing, because we've never actually faced this sort of extinction type of crisis in the history of mankind, or nor obviously in the history of your own lifetime. You don't have any immediate experience with the kind of peril that you're walking into, or the kind of danger that you're facing. And so we continue to kind of walk towards the edge of the cliff. So what exactly, am I getting at here? What is this extinction crisis? How do we know what the principle involved is here? So what I want to do is just kind of go through some of the work that we've done over the last months, year or so, that gives an idea of what is the principle which is behind the effects which we're now walking into as what would be an extinction type of crisis. And see how this is reflected as a principle in the way that the universe itself is in fact composed. And it starts with the work we've done in evolution and looking at the principle of evolution of life, the principle of development of life on our planet. But as that reflects a principle of development, a principle of creative change which governs the universe as a whole. So if we could just go to the first image in that folder there. Okay, so many people are familiar with this image at this point who have been on the website. If not, I'm going to talk you through it here a little bit. So this is just a graphic which depicts the process of development of life on the planet. And you see you've got the three different sort of epochs here, the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, and the Cenozoic. And each one of those is represented by a different sized cone. A cone, it's appropriate because a cone is something which is a process of growth. I mean, if you think of the cone not just as a static object, but what's the quality of action which typifies the creation of a conic object? It's one of a kind of self-similar growth, right? Self-similar circular growth. And so, if I had a stick, that'd be good. Does anyone have a stick on them? No. Or a laser pointer? If one of those by chance?
How about a pole?
Yes. Oh, Lewis has something there. Okay, yes. I'll use this I'll use this to vault over the rafters later. Okay, so you've got this first cone here, which you've labeled the Paleozoic, and you've got a second larger cone, the Mesozoic, and then a third even larger cone. So each one of these represents a different rate of growth, which, in this case, you might think of it in terms of the overall amount of energy that's moving through the system, through the living system. And that would be in the form of either just material, through things like respiration. May I make a point here on something that Vladimir Vernadsky discussed, that he looked at life as something which carries out a process of what he called biogenic migration. So you have all these elements that compose the world we live in. And one of the characteristics of life is that life is constantly moving material through its system. And he quoted a guy, what's his name? I can't remember his name. But he quoted a guy who discussed it as a kind of like a whirlpool. Right? People have all seen little whirlpools, or you've made little ones in the bathtub or something. Now, a whirlpool itself, if you try to pick it up, right, there's no real substance to the actual whirlpool. It's composed of the material that's moving through it. There's a certain quality of action which is generating this effect that you see as a whirlpool. But the whirlpool itself is composed by material constantly moving in and out of this energetic phenomenon. And so Vernadsky likened life or living objects to that kind of a thing. People know, like a human being, I forget what it is, but the material that composes your body is replaced every, whatever it is, 4 or 7 or some number of years. That most of the material that's composes your body right now is not the material that was there 10 years ago. You're constantly replacing the material. And so he likened living objects and life in general as like a whirlpool, constantly moving material through it, and that material maintains the structure. And so you could think of each one of these cones as representing a growth in the amount of material that's moving through the system. Energy, through respiration, eating, these kinds of things. So each one of these has a different, the size of the cone then represents the rate or the amount that's moving through that. So what you find is that through time, that's constantly growing. That as an actual law of development of life on this planet and of the biosphere as a whole, the biosphere being the envelope of life, the totality of the domain where life exists and acts, that the biosphere as a whole is constantly increasing the amount of material that's moving through the system. And so each one of these cones would represent a different rate of that. Now what we found is that that's then itself not a constant rate, that it's a nonlinear change, that at certain points, through the introduction of new types of life, well, we might in economics, we would relate to like introducing new technologies or something, or new innovations or new discoveries, that through the introduction of new forms of life, new powers of life, the rate at which that's occurring and the amount of material that's moving through the biosphere changes at a nonlinear level. But it occurs, those upshifts from a lower level of development to a higher level of development are also punctuated by these extinction points. And so maybe we just hone in on, say this, just to give you a better idea of this period around from the Mesozoic to the Cenozoic, which is demarcated by the KT extinction. This is the extinction that wiped out the dinosaurs. Now, the dinosaurs actually get a bad name, but they were in many instances, we have evidence that they actually were an evolutionary development over even the reptiles. That reptiles, for example, are all cold-blooded animals. There's evidence that dinosaurs may have been some sort of intermediate between cold-blooded and warm-blooded. That they have other, their pelvis and things. They're able to have more of an upright type of posture that you don't find in most reptiles. So there was a certain development that took place in the dinosaurs. They just kind of went wild with it and sort of outran their environment with their limited capabilities. But what you had in the shift so you had this mass extinction, which, to be honest, no one really knows exactly what happened. So the popular line is that a big comet came down around the Yucatan area of Mexico, and that's what somehow wiped out the dinosaurs. But there are some real problems with that because, one, why was it so selective? If it was simply just that this meteor hit and it threw up all this ash and other things, and it kind of darkened out the sun and made the breathing environment very difficult, what have you, why was it largely just the dinosaurs that were affected? Why did they go extinct where other forms of life, which did exist in small pockets and small numbers, not get wiped out? Like the reptiles that still existed, or some of the mammals which had come into existence at that point. Now this occurred about 65 million years ago. The first mammals came on the scene roughly 100, 120 some million years ago. So you did have mammal life had been introduced into the biosphere at that point. But here you had a point where the dinosaurs got wiped out, you had an extinction phase, but with that extinction you then had correspondingly an upshift. So the dinosaurs get wiped out, but it wasn't a wiping out of the whole system. It wasn't a collapse of the entire biosphere. It actually represented an upshift of the entire biosphere. Because then what came in to replace the dinosaurs as a dominant form of animal life were the mammals. Now the mammals have characteristics which do make them a more dominant species, a more capable species. It's not just that they're a other species than dinosaurs. They're not just different. they are actually better when measured in terms of things like energy throughput. Mammals have a much higher metabolism than dinosaurs, right? For the same body weight, a mammal requires about 10 times as much food as a dinosaur to maintain things like warm-bloodedness. Now, full-on warm-bloodedness is an advantage for many reasons. One, you can exist in the winter, right? There's a reason why dinosaurs largely resided in warmer areas, or like today, you don't see snakes and other kinds of things in the winter, because reptiles and things which are cold-blooded or some mixture are very much, their activity and their ability to exist is very much determined by external circumstances. Once you have the introduction of warm-bloodedness, you have much more of the creature itself has much more of a self-determined role in its existence. So that represents a certain upshift, a certain new power. You know, like we have, say, with human beings, right? Whenever we develop a new technology, like developing fuels and the internal combustion engine, that gives us a new power for self-determination. We're no longer dependent on, say, our horses and whether or not the horse wants to be a stubborn cuss or not, or whether or not there's enough food to eat, or what have you, right? Things like regulating the internal temperature of our houses, or being able to run light bulbs, right? Being able to see, okay, electricity obviously is a huge one. The fact that we can stay up till late hours reading books and doing work and these kinds of things because we've got light bulbs and electricity. That represented that kind of a shift. We're no longer dependent simply on the sun to provide lighting, right? Where once the sun goes down, you go down, which was largely what it used to be like. So, in a similar way, the shift from, say, cold-blooded to warm-bloodedness represented that kind of internal determination on the part of life. Mammals could now exist year-round. They could exist in much more diverse climates. Right? You have mammals from the North Pole to the equator. But that required certain other changes in the biosphere. Mammals, given that they have to eat 10 times as much food to maintain that kind of activity, meant that you couldn't really support a mammal population with the type of floral life that you had prior to this shift. So what you saw in the biosphere is that at the same time that there was a shift towards mammal life, there's also a shift from a plant life dominated by gymnosperms, which are seeding plants, but they have a very complex sort of relationship to how they reproduce and whatnot. To then you had angiosperms. Now angiosperms are typified by things, fruiting plants, flowering plants. So the advantage of now having plants that had fruits on them is that fruits are a very dense source of energy, right? You have apples, things like this. So now you had plants that were concentrating the energy of the sun in very localized areas. So that now these mammals, which required a much higher amount of throughput of energy through consumption, now had, here we go, all of a sudden the biosphere generates these angiosperms, fruits. So now the mammals, which require more energy, also have a fuel source to feed that energetic requirement. It's also no coincidence that at the exact same time that flowering and fruiting plants came on the scene is exactly the same time that bees emerged. So bees, which play the crucial role, or one of the crucial roles in the what's it called, the pollination process, came on the scene at the exact same time. So you had this shift where the whole biosphere, from the animal life to the plant life to the insect life, all went through this upshift towards what we would measure, as Dave brought up, generally as an increase in energy flux density of the system. So the whole system went through an upshift, which is what's represented from the move from this lower order cone here of the Mesozoic to this higher order cone, the Cenozoic. But it was a nonlinear shift. It wasn't just simple growth or more. It was that you had introduced into the system as a whole new forms of technology. We might consider biological technologies, warm-bloodedness, fruiting and flowering plants, bees, and there's other things that you could look at. So the whole system went through a revolutionary upshift. Anything that wasn't part of that shift, anything that wasn't coherent with that upshift towards increasing the energy flux density of the system went extinct. And so the poor, lowly dinosaurs, they just couldn't keep up with the system as a whole. The system representing the universe said, no, we're moving forward. We got to increase the energy flux density of the system. The system moved forward. Those forms of life which were coherent with that progress survived and moved forward, part of the upshift. Anything that didn't represent that, like the dinosaurs, like other forms of life and plants and whatnot, largely went extinct. You know, some stuff hung on. Obviously, we still have some reptiles and whatnot. But for the most part, anything that couldn't keep up was gone, got wiped out. Because as we've discussed, a principle of the universe is progress. The universe is progressive. It's creative. And so if you want to be coherent with the direction of the universe as a whole, you must progress. And you must accelerate the rate at which you're progressing. Because you'll find that these shifts have actually been increasing. The rate at which these shifts are occurring has been increasing, at least over the history that we know of life on the planet. Now, let's make one other point, is that these processes are not simply localized processes here on Earth. That we've done other work showing that, one, those terrestrial factors which do play into driving these extinctions, like whether it's comet hits or it's massive tectonic activity or it's volcanic activity, all these things which have played a role in driving these extinctions themselves can all be connected to galactic processes, largely the increase of cosmic radiation. That increases in the flux of cosmic radiation onto the planet have been linked to either correlations, or there are certain mechanistic hypotheses behind it, have actually been linked to driving these processes which contribute to the extinctions. And so the process of extinctions, but then the upshifts, which also I won't go into now, do have a certain galactic correlation. So what you're seeing is that this process of development on the planet as a whole is itself a reflection of something which is occurring on a much larger scale, on a galactic scale. Then on the galactic and extragalactic scale, you've got this process of change, this creative process of development forward, which is then reflected in what we see as the development of the biosphere with its extinctions and then corresponding upshifts. So we can go to, I think it's number, I have a 3 in front of it there. Yeah, the next one. So now the point we've been making is that for human beings also, if we ourselves are going to continue to exist on this planet, in this universe, we must also organize our activity to be coherent with this kind of process of development. And we've seen, to the extent that mankind has been successful up to this point, it's been because we have operated according to this same kind of principle, this principle of anti-entropic development, through the introduction of new universal principles. And the rate at which it's been occurring has been accelerating. So here's just a little schematic of some of the revolutions that have occurred throughout human history and the corresponding kind of energy flux density that goes along with this. So you see it was about 400,000 years between the time that we used wood as a principal source of energy to then coal. The move from wood to coal meant a move from, in terms of per pound energy produced, a move from 1.9 to 3.8 kilowatt hours of energy produced per pound. Then you had an acceleration from the time from coal to then petroleum of 2,200 years. Then after that, it was only 100 years until we went to nuclear. Now, I'll make another point there. But you see what this is representing. The move from wood to coal to petroleum to then nuclear has meant this increase from 1.9 to 3.8 to 6.4, so then you get this huge jump to 18.9 thousand kilowatt hours per pound of material. So what this represents is the fact that per unit weight of the material you're using as your energy source, you're constantly getting this increase in the amount of usable energy out of that product. But it's not something which is linear. It's not just more. I mean, you could say, well, yeah, maybe that's the case, but, ooh, I'm so scared of uranium. And I see that that's a lot more, and yes, I would like more. Couldn't I just burn a shitload of wood or something? I don't believe the lies. We're not running out of oil. We got tons of oil, so I'll just burn up a bunch of oil, and we can get that same amount of energy, and we don't have to worry about this scary uranium. One, it's a lie, because I'll get to another point. We can deal with the uranium. But the thing is, it's not just a matter of energy as a quantitative issue. Because yes, the amount of energy that, say, you get out of a pound of uranium, you could produce quantitatively the same amount through burning a lot of petroleum. But the area that you would use in burning it would be much greater. The rate at which you could burn it would be much less. And the overall effect, you could never actually achieve the temperature equivalent of concentration of that energy with petroleum that you can with uranium. So while you could get the same quantity of energy out of burning petroleum that you could out of uranium, hypothetically, the concentration of that energy, which would then be a qualitative use of it, could never be achieved. And for example, one of the things that can be done with just nuclear power is you can actually carry out a transmutation process. I mean, most people think of the product, what remains after going through, say, a fuel cycle of nuclear fuel as waste. But as we've developed new technologies that come out of, for example, the technologies developed as we move towards, here depicted as deuterium, which would be fusion processes, things like the kinds of high temperature plasmas that have been developed to realize fusion actually can be used to transform what we typically think of as nuclear waste into one of the most valuable ores on the planet. And actually the Chinese consider what we call nuclear waste as a valuable ore. Because in the process of the nuclear burn, it's going through a transmutation process, where just like all the elements that we have here on Earth, most of them came through some sort of transmutation of helium and hydrogen out of the sun, through where all the periodic table is created. That same periodic table is actually being created in a nuclear process. That if you were able to extract all the different elements out of your barrel of waste, you'd actually find the entire periodic table, and you'd find a lot of what are considered rare earth materials. So if you can figure out a way to separate all these materials and extract them, you're creating new material. You're actually creating new elements through this process. And you're creating elements which are very rare and hard to find here on Earth, which then, think about what that means for your economy. Now, what they've done with these the fusion torch is that you are now able to do that. If we were to develop this technology of the fusion torch properly, we'd be able to extract all kinds of rare materials out of this nuclear byproduct, and anything that we did deem as dangerous, because radiation can be dangerous in large amounts, you can actually transmutate into non-radioactive substances. And so all these lies about the danger of nuclear power is just a hoax. One, we'd be able to deal with the waste and turn it into non-dangerous product, but in the process, we're creating all kinds of new materials which would be vital to our continued development here on the planet and in outer space. That process of transmutation could never, ever, in a billion years, be achieved through the burning of petroleum. You could never burn enough petroleum to create the kind of energy densities that would be required to create this kind of transmutative process. And so here, again, what you're seeing with these successive jumps is not just a quantitative increase, it's a qualitative change. That each step is a qualitative change towards higher energy flux densities, new powers. Each one of these shifts represents a completely new power for mankind to have dominion and control over his universe, over his world. And that's really what the creative principle is. It's actually mankind constantly being able to go further in his power to transform the universe around him, to create conditions for his further development, where none of the steps in between is ever the ends in itself. While the end is never just, oh, well, we'd like to feed everybody, or we'd like to house everybody, or we'd like to achieve a certain material existence for everybody. The ends is the means, in the sense that what you're creating with each step is a new potential for further creativity. That really what you see in this process is it gets at the point Dave was making at the end. That which exists for its own further development, its own further unfolding. That each step in the process, ultimately what you're creating is you're creating a new potential for an even further expression of the creative principle. That creativity is the one thing in the universe that is what you might say is has a self-reflexive identity. Is the one thing which exists for its own purpose. Right? The reason for creativity's existence is creativity. And so that's what we see with man uniquely. And you don't find it anywhere else. The biosphere does it, but no element of the biosphere is aware of it. Right? The dinosaur wasn't like, yeah, I got to step aside, let my mammalian brothers move forward so they can further the process. No element in the biosphere is aware of this creative principle. They partake in it. They are an effect of it. But only man uniquely is able to self-consciously take on that challenge. And this gets at, we won't necessarily go through it now, maybe in the Q&A, but this gets at exactly what Mr. LaRouche has been bringing up about the role of the future. That mankind always acts, when acting creatively, from the standpoint of the future. Of always saying, what is that future which must come into existence, but which doesn't express itself yet? And that's then what drives your activity today. If you're thinking in terms of what has worked in the past, let me just repeat that process, you're actually moving backwards. Because even to stand still in this universe, just to stand still in the universe, you have to progress. If you try to hold with a zero growth, subsistence kind of existence, you're actually moving backwards because the universe is accelerating forward. So even just to stand still, you have to progress. But to progress forward, you have to already, your mind, your imagination, must already exist in that future state. And it's that future state which informs your activity today. And that really becomes what the credit policy is. You say, where must we be in 100 years? Oh, we must be developing the moon. We must have developed Nawapa. We must be moving towards Mars. Well, that where you must be in the future then becomes the thing that determines how you act today. And the credit system just becomes the implementation of that. We want to get to Mars, we've got to generate credit to direct the flow of resources into development of fusion. We've got to direct the flow of manpower into building Nawapa. We've got to direct the flow of investigation into mastering matter-antimatter reactions. So the credit becomes the mechanism through which you direct your activity today from the standpoint of where you necessarily must be in the future. And so it is always the future which is determining your present. And that's creativity. That's the role that man must play. So I'll just end at that so that we think we're getting kicked out at 5. So give us about 50 minutes for questions.
we can take questions for a bit. Before we take questions, actually, I wanted to introduce Mark quick. Stand up. He, for people who don't know, Mark Quick has been running, how many times have you run against Scott?
I ran for Congress 2 years ago against Congressman Garrett. I ran for the Assembly last year, and I went for Congress again this year.
We've met in the course of fighting. Anyway, fighting for the nation. So if anyone has questions, you don't have to ask me questions. I'm moderating because we had a discussion about who would moderate. And I was told that I should just do it because I always end up taking over anyway. So if you have questions for Cody and Dave on anything that's been presented or for me, please ask away. Bruce?
Yeah, I have a question related to Cody. If you have mentioned that the Japanese, you can hear me? I can hear you.
But come up because we're recording. We want to hear you.
I had a question. If you have mentioned that the Japanese can use the byproduct of nuclear fuel that we dump away, we dig in we hide it in the earth.
Right.
Do you think one day we get to that point where that'll be a valuable commodity as opposed to burying it?
Yeah, I mean, the technology exists up to a level. It just hasn't been fully developed by engineering to make it a fully applicable technology. Just isn't there yet. But yeah, I mean, it's there. Theoretically, we know how to do it, and we've already tested the principle. So it's really, the thing is, I guess the big thing is the fight. Okay, yeah. I guess really the challenge is, at this point, it's political. Because the reason why this technology hasn't been developed, because if it was developed and people fully understood it, number one, you no longer could scare the hell out of people about nuclear waste. And so as we've continuously developed, really what you're seeing around the fight for the development of nuclear power goes back to the fight of Zeus versus Prometheus. Right? Zeus condemned Prometheus to eternal torture because Prometheus gave to man the power of fire, also poetry, language, creativity, right? The power to have control over his dominion. Zeus, who was a god, or thought of himself as a god, which really is emblematic of the oligarchy, who see themselves as gods, don't want man to develop, don't want man to increase his population. More people means you need greater technology to support more people. Well, to have more technology and more development means you have to have a more educated people, a more developed people. When people are educated and developed, they're no longer going to bow down to an oligarchy. They're no longer going to be as susceptible to enslavement. And so the oligarchy has always had a policy of keep the population low, keep them dumb, and keep them under control. And so the policy to not develop nuclear power and to abandon the kind of technologies that would turn nuclear power not only into a technology for abundant energy, but to turn into a technology where we can start to create new materials and new states of existence, the policy has been to stop it, to ban it. Because the intention has always been to, well, we can't totally get rid of nuclear yet, though they'd like to, but let's do anything we can to keep everyone afraid of it, to keep pushing the line that it's scary and deadly, and if you have a nuclear power plant anywhere in your vicinity, you're going to grow extra arms out of your head or something like that, or you're going to be eating three-eyed fish and whatnot. But it's all bullcrap. I mean, I know for a fact I used to go swimming in waters that were flowing right past a nuclear power plant in Pennsylvania, 3 Mile Island, right? The Devil's Island there, 3 Mile Island. No, it's totally safe. But it's been a propaganda to keep the masses away from and scared of nuclear power. So the technology's there. And the interesting thing is the technology itself to do things like the extraction of all these materials out of the waste actually came out of moving towards the next phase of development out of fusion, because it was in developing these very high temperature plasmas for things like the tokamak reactors that then we found that in these plasmas you could ionize the material, and then you could do a certain kind of selective separation out of the plasmas for then basically turning that into a very valuable ore, where you could extract all the different elements of the periodic table from that. So it demonstrates this creative principle that, like we'd see with NWAPA or something. The completion of NWAPA will be realized as we push the boundaries on the development of the Arctic. The completion of the Arctic development project will be realized whenever we move towards pushing the boundaries on Moon-Mars development. So it always is this principle that each previous phase actually only gets realized as you move towards the next higher phase, and it's the spin-offs and developments of the higher phase which actually feed back and realize the full potential of your lower phase. So that's where we are at this point.
I just want to add something. Because the Hanford Nuclear Reservation out in eastern Washington, it's true. I mean, there are barrels of this stuff just buried in the ground. Now, what they're doing right now is they're digging it out. They have a process which was supposed to cost $2 billion, I think was the original plan, which was effectively to turn it into glass. And then you pour it into these concrete containers, or and then eventually when the glass cools, you pull out the glass, and I think it's less radioactive or something, or easier transport, or I forget all the details of it, but and then they're going to haul those off to a Yucca Mountain or some sort of storage place, right? Now, it was proposed that with a very simple process, now keep in mind the original plan was $2 billion for this whole thing. I think we're up to about $16 billion, and it's no end in sight virtually. What was proposed was already, just with a simple filtration process, you can pull out cesium, which is fairly abundant in the so-called waste. And you could take the cesium and just sell the cesium and finance the whole, turning the rest of the so-called waste into glass. But they won't even do that, which would mean that it would pay for itself. But instead, the government's paying for the project now as a giant, because they won't even do like that minimal thing just to, deal with the so-called waste. It's not waste. That's the point. So anyway, I just wanted to throw that in.
Hey, Dave.
Oh yeah.
Richland, now that's out there.
Yeah, that's Richland is, yeah.
Actually, in the early 70s.
Speak loud so everyone can hear you.
In the early 70s, Exxon developed a reprocessing plan, and it was dismantled during the Carter administration, where they could actually reuse 99% of all the so-called nuclear waste. Which I tell people is really a gold mine.
Wow, I can't, $16 billion that we spent on turning this stuff into glass, I can't imagine that we couldn't have put that $16 billion to one of these facilities, exactly.
They actually had the money set aside.
So,
And